I stood frozen in front of the massive display screen in the executive boardroom, my hand hovering over the presentation remote. The air in the room was thick with a mixture of pity and professional indifference from the 6 board members and investors seated around the mahogany table. On the screen was the culmination of my 5 years of research, a breakthrough molecular stabilization process that was supposed to secure the future of Albright Biotech. I had spent countless nights in the lab, testing and refining the target delivery matrix, sacrificing sleep and my health to make this succeed. I was 55 years old, and this project was the crowning achievement of my career, the proof that I was still at the top of my field. I had built this breakthrough from scratch, spending long hours analyzing protein reactions and chemical bonds. This meeting was my chance to present my work directly to the people who held the financial keys to our expansion. I had prepared my notes carefully, ensuring every data point was backed by rigorous lab records. I felt a sense of pride as I looked at the slides, knowing that this stabilization process would revolutionize how targeted medication was delivered to patients. It was not just a corporate milestone, it was my legacy. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, Owen," Brielle Albright said, her voice dripping with artificial politeness as she strode into the room. She was wearing a tailored designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She was 28 years old, George Albright's daughter, hired 8 months ago as our strategic innovation director. Her timing was impeccable, and her expression was one of supreme confidence. She did not look at me. Instead, she walked straight to the front of the room, effectively pushing me to the side of the stage. "But there is a major change of plans," Brielle continued, turning her back on me to address the investors. "My father asked me to share some crucial updates. We have developed an alternative delivery approach that shows significantly better commercial potential and lower market risks." My chest tightened and my throat went completely dry. The investors, who had been nodding along with my presentation just seconds ago, straightened in their leather chairs, their focus immediately shifting to Brielle. Julian Vance, the lead investor, leaned forward with intense interest, ignoring my presence entirely. Brielle pulled out her own flash drive and connected it to the system. With a casual swipe, she minimized my presentation, effectively erasing my 5 years of work from the screen. It felt like she was erasing my entire existence. "We do not need your ideas anymore, Owen," she murmured in a low voice, cold and quiet, meant only for my ears as she passed me. Then she raised her voice for the rest of the room. "Owen's initial work provided some useful baseline data, but my team has taken a far more innovative and viable direction." I stood there in the shadow of my own project, watching her display slides that looked exactly like the concepts I had developed in my private laboratory. They were ideas I had written in my private research journals, things I had only discussed in confidence during late-night brainstorming sessions. Somehow she had copied them and was now presenting them as her own creation. She spoke about the technology with a slick corporate vocabulary, using buzzwords to explain chemical processes she had never actually tested. When she finished her presentation, the boardroom erupted in applause. Julian Vance stood up, smiling warmly at her. "This is exactly what we were waiting for, Brielle. Highly impressive and far more commercially viable than the previous proposal. We are ready to move to the next phase of funding." I packed my laptop into my briefcase with slow, mechanical movements. My hands were shaking, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. Nobody in the room noticed when I slipped my security key card out of my pocket and placed it quietly on the table. As I walked toward the door, I caught George Albright's eye. The CEO, a man who had once promised me that I would retire as a partner in this company, looked right through me as if I were a ghost. "Enjoy the funding, George," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. I walked out of the building and into the bright morning sun. It was only when I reached my car that the adrenaline faded and my hands began to tremble violently against the steering wheel. 5 years of dedication, my proprietary molecular formulas, my entire professional legacy, all swept away in a single meeting. Brielle had studied my work, copied my data, and presented it as her own, and the company had let her do it. But as I started the engine, a cold sense of clarity settled over me. I had 48 hours before George realized what I had actually done before leaving. I drove home, already planning my next moves. My name is Owen Fletcher. I am not the typical biotech scientist. I do not have a wealthy family background or political connections. My mother was a housekeeper, and I studied at whatever tables was free in our crowded apartments. I worked my way through college on academic scholarships, spending my nights washing lab equipment just to be near the research. George hired me 4 years ago to lead the development of our compound stabilization project. He had praised my unconventional methods. "We need people who think outside the corporate box, Owen," he had told me during my interview. For years, I worked 16-hour days to develop a method to stabilize volatile proteins for targeted chemotherapy. It was my life, but everything changed when Brielle arrived. She came fresh from an elite business school, immediately taking a corner office and questioning my protocols. She wanted to look at my private notebooks, claiming she needed to understand the commercial applications. I had trusted her. I had shared my research, explaining the complex chemical bonds. "You are a brilliant scientist, Owen," she had said to me once, "but you do not understand the legalities of this industry." Those words were not advice. They were a roadmap of her plan to steal my career. Now she had done it, but she did not realize that I had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. I unlocked the door to my apartment and tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter. Barnaby, my orange cat, greeted me with a soft meow, rubbing against my legs. I picked him up, holding him close, as the silence of the apartment washed over me. The public humiliation in the boardroom was painful, but the anger inside me was burning hot. They thought they had taken everything. They thought I was just an aging scientist who could be easily discarded. They were wrong. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Chloe Bennett, the senior lab technician, and my closest colleague. "Owen, what happened? Everyone in the lab is whispering, but no one is telling us anything." "They said you walked out of the investor meeting." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Before I could reply, a second message flashed. This one was from George Albright himself. "We need to talk immediately, Owen. Get back to my office now." I ignored George's message, turned off the phone, and set it on the table. I sat down at my desk, opening my personal laptop. I needed to focus. The next 48 hours were critical, and I could not afford any distractions. I spent the afternoon organizing my research files, ensuring that every document was date-stamped and properly backed up. The next morning, I dressed in a formal suit and drove back to the research park. The security guard at the gate, a friendly man named Todd, gave me a puzzled look as he checked my ID. "Morning, Owen. I heard a rumor that you resigned yesterday afternoon. Is that true?" "Not officially, Todd," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "Just handling some final details." The laboratory was filled with an uneasy energy when I walked through the doors. The quiet murmurs of my colleagues ceased instantly. People looked down at their desks, avoiding my eyes. It was the classic corporate reaction to someone who had fallen out of favor with the leadership. I walked straight to my workbench and began packing my personal journals, reference books, and coffee mug into a box. Chloe stepped up beside me, her voice hushed and anxious. "Owen, George has been in a rage since yesterday evening. He was shouting at the legal team all night." "What did you do?" "I only did what was necessary to protect myself, Chloe," I said, placing a scientific text into the box. "He is looking for you. He says you withdrew the master files for the stabilization process from the server." Before I could answer, George's voice echoed across the open lab. "Owen! In my office. Right now." The walk to the executive suite felt like walking toward a firing squad. The lab staff watched in absolute silence. George stood in the doorway of his office, his face red with anger, his tie slightly loosened. He looked stressed, a stark contrast to his usual polished demeanor. "Close the door," George commanded as I walked in. I closed the heavy glass door, but remained standing near it, refusing to sit. It was a small boundary, but I wanted him to know I was no longer his employee. "Where are the stabilization matrix files, Owen?" George demanded, leaning over his desk. "The investors are coming back in 2 hours to sign the final contract, and my lab team cannot run the live demonstration. The system says the core algorithm is missing." I let his words hang in the air, watching the panic flicker in his eyes. "I am afraid I do not know what you mean, George," I said quietly. Yesterday, Brielle announced that the company is moving forward with her concept. Since my ideas are no longer needed, I took my personal research with me. George's face darkened further. Her concept is based on your stabilization process. We cannot run the protein delivery system without the final algorithm. What did you delete from our servers? I did not delete a single file from the company's servers, George, I replied, maintaining a calm, even tone. That would be database sabotage, which is illegal. Everything I developed during my official working hours using company equipment is exactly where it has always been on your servers. Then why does the system fail every time we run the simulation? He snarled. The investors expect a live demonstration of the targeted delivery in less than 90 minutes. The office door swung open, and Brielle rushed in, her previous confidence completely gone, replaced by visible panic. Father, the lab technicians are saying the compound is degrading within minutes. They cannot stabilize the molecular bonds. We need the final formula. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. What is he doing here? I turned to look at her. I am just gathering my personal belongings, Brielle. Since you made it clear that my services are no longer required, I am leaving. Brielle looked at her father, then back at me. You did something to the files. You sabotaged the project. I did no such thing, I said, adjusting the box in my arms. Perhaps you should try using your own innovative approach. The one you presented to the investors yesterday. Her face went pale. You know my presentation was based on your notes. Is that so? You did not mention my name once during that meeting. In fact, you told the investors that your team had created a new, superior direction. George stepped forward, trying to soften his tone. Owen, let us be reasonable. The investors are ready to sign an $80 million deal. Fix the algorithm, and we can renegotiate your contract. We will give you a promotion, a salary increase, and full credit on the patent application. I looked at George, seeing the desperation behind his corporate mask. I cannot help you, George. The work on your server is the only version that belongs to Albright Biotech. The refined stabilization matrix was developed outside of my employment terms. George glared at me, his fists clenching. What do you mean, outside your employment terms? You developed this technology while working at Albright Biotech. Everything you create belongs to us. It is in your employment contract. Actually, George, it is not, I said, pulling a document folder from my briefcase. I suggest you consult California Labor Code Section 2870. Under the law, any invention developed by an employee entirely on their own time, without using the employer's equipment, supplies, facilities, or trade secret information, belongs solely to the employee. I was very careful. The core stabilization matrix was designed on my personal laptop at my home. Using research materials I purchased independently, Brielle took a step toward me. That is a lie. You used our laboratory data. I did not, I replied. The data on the company's server represents an older, unstable version of the formula, the one that degrades within minutes. I realized 4 months ago that the molecular bonds were unstable. I also realized that you were searching my office after hours to copy my notes. That is why I created a separate, independent research path at my home. The refined stable formula was filed under a provisional patent 3 weeks ago by my own independent company, Fletcher Therapeutics, under Federal Patent Law 35 U.S.C. Section 111. George stared at me, his jaw dropping. You filed a patent in your own name? Yes. And since my patent is pending, any attempt by Albright Biotech to use or sell my refined stabilization matrix during your demonstration today would constitute willful patent infringement under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. I have already instructed my legal counsel to file an immediate injunction if you attempt to run the simulation using my proprietary formula. You cannot do this, Owen, Brielle cried. We have investors waiting. I already have, I said. I picked up my box of personal belongings and walked toward the door. George took a step to block my path. You are not leaving this building, Owen. We will sue you for everything you have. Are you physically preventing me from leaving? George? I asked, looking him directly in the eye. Because that would lead to charges of false imprisonment. And given the security cameras in the hallway, I do not think your legal team would advise that. George stood frozen for a few seconds, his face twitching with silent rage. Slowly, he stepped aside. I walked out of his office, down the corridor, and through the laboratory. The staff watched me go, the silence in the room absolute. I walked out of the building and did not look back. I crossed the street to the local coffee shop, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window. I watched the main entrance of Albright Biotech. Exactly 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up. Julian Vance and two other investors stepped out, walking quickly into the building. They had no idea they were walking into a corporate disaster. My phone rang 30 minutes later. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered it calmly. "Owen Fletcher speaking." "Owen, this is Julian Vance," the voice said, tight and strained. "I am in the boardroom at Albright Biotech. The live demonstration is a complete failure, and George is claiming there is a temporary technical issue. What is going on?" "I am no longer with the company, Julian," I replied. "I resigned yesterday. We need to talk. Where are you?" "I am at the coffee shop across the street. I will be here for another 15 minutes. Julian hung up. 5 minutes later, he walked into the coffee shop, looking exhausted. He sat down across from me in the booth. "George claims you deleted the core files before you left," Julian said, looking at me searchingly. "I did not delete anything," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "The files on their server are intact. The problem is that the version they have is unstable. It is a formula that degrades. I solved the stabilization problem, but I did it on my own time, using my own resources. George says the intellectual property belongs to the company. He can claim whatever he wants. But California Labor Code Section 2870 protects independent inventions. My company, Fletcher Therapeutics, holds the provisional patent. If they use my formula, they are violating federal law." Julian leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You planned this." "I protected myself, Julian. When the CEO's daughter starts entering your office at night to steal your research, you do not wait to be fired. You prepare." Julian stared at me for a long moment, processing my words. "You have proof that Brielle was stealing your research?" "I do," I said, opening my laptop. "I noticed my notebooks were being moved 4 months ago. I requested the building's security footage, claiming I had lost some personal papers. I have files showing Brielle entering my laboratory at 10:30 p.m. on 3 separate nights. She did not have authorization to be in my lab space after hours, let alone access my personal desk. Under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, 18 U.S.C., Section 1836, her actions constitute unauthorized access and misappropriation of trade secrets." I turned the laptop screen toward him, playing a short video clip. The video clearly showed Brielle searching through my desk drawers, taking photos of my journals with her phone. Julian closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. "This is a disaster." George assured us that the technology was fully owned by the company and that Brielle was the lead developer. "We were prepared to invest $80 million. If you invest in Albright Biotech, you are investing in a company that does not own the technology and is facing multiple lawsuits for patent infringement and trade secret misappropriation," I said quietly. "Or you can invest in the actual creator of the technology." Julian looked up, his interest piqued. "What are you proposing, Owen?" "Fletcher Therapeutics is seeking investment to bring the stabilization process to market. I have already secured a small lab space, and I have the complete working formula. No corporate bureaucracy, no nepotism. Just science." Julian looked at the security footage on the screen, then at the patent documentation. "I need to discuss this with my partners. Can you meet us at our offices at 3 p.m. today?" "I will be there," I said, closing my laptop. At 3 p.m. I walked into the conference room of Vance & Associates in downtown San Francisco. Julian and the other 5 investors were already seated around a glass table. The atmosphere was serious, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation. I spent the next hour presenting the science behind the molecular stabilization matrix. I did not use flashy marketing slides or empty business jargon. I explained the chemistry, the molecular bonds, and the testing data. I showed them the results of my independent tests, demonstrating how the proteins remained stable for over 48 hours, allowing for precise drug delivery. When I finished, Amara Cole, one of the senior partners, spoke up. "The science is clear, Owen. It is an incredible breakthrough, but we must be certain about the legal standing. George Albright's attorneys will fight you on the IP ownership." "They can try," I replied, sliding a blue folder across the table. "This contains the complete legal audit of my research log. I documented every hour spent on this project outside of the office. I bought my own equipment, registered the purchases, and worked from my home IP address. My attorney, who specializes in California labor law, has verified that my research fits perfectly within the protections of California Labor Code Section 2870. Furthermore, we have the security footage of Brielle's unauthorized entry. If George sues us, we will countersue for trade secret theft and harassment. Amara opened the folder, reading the documents carefully. She nodded to Julian. It is solid. George has no case, and if he goes to court, the publicity will destroy whatever is left of his company. Julian looked around the room, reading the faces of his partners. We are pausing all discussions with Albright Biotech. We will perform a formal due diligence check on Fletcher Therapeutics. If everything matches, we are prepared to offer you the funding. Thank you, Julian, I said, shaking his hand. As I left the building, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The battle was not over, but the ground had shifted. I was no longer defending myself against a corporate giant. I was building my own future. By the next morning, the industry news was filled with reports of the collapse of the Albright Biotech funding deal. Rumors of executive misconduct and technology theft began to circulate. The company's stock price dropped by 18% in a single day of trading. Received several frantic calls from George's assistants, but I blocked the numbers. That afternoon, Chloe Bennett arrived at my small, newly rented laboratory space in South San Francisco. She looked around the modest room, which was filled with used equipment I had purchased with my savings, and smiled. "It is not as fancy as George's lab, Owen," she said. "No, it is not," I agreed. "But everything in this room is ours. We do not have to worry about anyone taking credit for our work." "I resigned this morning, Owen," Chloe said, setting her bag down. So did 3 of the other senior researchers. "We want to work for Fletcher Therapeutics." "Welcome aboard, Chloe," I said, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "We have a lot of work to do." Later that evening, as I was calibrating a centrifuge, the front door buzzer rang. I checked the security camera. To my surprise, Brielle Albright was standing outside. She was not wearing her designer suit. Her hair was messy, and her eyes were red. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. She stepped into the lab, looking around the small space with a mixture of confusion and defeat. "My father was removed by the board this afternoon," she said, her voice shaking. "They are threatening to sue us for misrepresenting the technology to the investors. We are losing everything." "I am sorry to hear that, Brielle," I said. Keeping my voice neutral, "How did you do this?" she asked, looking at me with genuine desperation. "We had the contracts, the lawyers, the corporate power. You were just a scientist. You forgot that science is about finding the truth, Brielle," I said. "You thought you could steal the results without understanding the process. You thought a flashy presentation could replace years of hard work. But in this industry, the technology has to actually work. You cannot fake a molecular stabilization matrix." She stared at me, her mouth opening slightly, but she had nothing to say. The arrogance that had defined her for months had vanished. She turned and walked out of the door, disappearing into the evening fog. 2 weeks later, Julian Vance called me with the results of the due diligence audit. "Everything is clean, Owen," he said. "The legal team is satisfied that Fletcher Therapeutics owns the intellectual property. We are prepared to offer an initial funding round of $60 million, with an option for an additional $40 million based on clinical trial milestones." "That is acceptable, Julian," I said. "Let us schedule the contract signing." "There is one more thing," Julian added. "The board of Albright Biotech is looking for a new CEO to manage the liquidation of their assets. They asked if you would be interested in buying their laboratory equipment at a discount." "Send me the list," I smiled. "I will see if there is anything we can use." When I hung up the phone, I looked around the laboratory. Chloe and the other researchers were busy preparing the first batches of the stabilized compound for testing. The atmosphere was filled with energy, collaboration, and mutual respect. I realized then that my revenge was not about destroying George or Brielle. Their own greed and dishonesty had done that for them. My revenge was in building something that was entirely mine, in proving that real expertise cannot be stolen, and in creating a place where scientists could work with dignity. I walked over to my workbench, adjusted the microscope, and focused on the cellular structure on the slide. The molecular bonds were perfectly stable, holding their form under the light. We were ready to begin.